Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Dr. Trina Shanks. I'm the Director of Community Engagement and a professor here at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm a person wearing glasses. I'm wearing a black shirt today. A note about accessibility. If you hit CC or show subtitle at the bottom, you can activate captions. And in the upper right-hand side, you can toggle between gallery and speaker view, so you can see just the PowerPoint and who is talking. We have a great session planned for you today, exploring Detroit's
He said he's coming over now. Go ahead and turn the TV on.
And the issues that motivated the proposal and the continued activism of the city to bring attention to social justice issues. But before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to give a brief land and labor acknowledgement. Next slide, please. Thank you. Engage is aware and that we function as a society with a deep history of exploitation, stealing both land and labor that has affected and shaped our indigenous and Black populations for generations. So we're committed to acknowledging this and everything that we do to try to help create a more inclusive tomorrow. So I'll take a few minutes to allow you to read our land and labor acknowledgement before we go on. Thank you. Next slide. I'd like to now introduce the Engage team. So we have Sonia Harb, Aisha Ghazi Edwin, Fatima Salman, Blake Newman, and Cleo Walsh, our field intern for the semester. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Aisha to continue moderating the panel and introduce our guests.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Aisha Ghazi Edwin. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers, and I'm a person with black hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt, and I will be facilitating this session. So to all participants, this is meant to be an interactive session. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them in the chat, and we will unmute you. So as Dr. Shanks described, we have a special session today exploring Detroit's Proposal P and the issues that motivated the proposal, as well as the ongoing activism in the city to bring attention to these issues. With that, please join me in welcoming our amazing guests. I do want to say, unfortunately, City Councilmember Raquel Castaneda-Lopez was unable to join us due to a land transfer that's happening in committee right now that was really important. She wishes that she could be here. So additionally joining us include Executive Director of We the People Detroit, Monica Lewis-Patrick, Detroit's Black Lives Matters Co-Lead Organizer, John Sloan, and Executive Director of We the People Michigan, Art Reyes. So now I'd like to give our panelists just a few minutes, maybe 3 to 5 minutes each, just to introduce yourselves and the prompts that you should answer are on the slide. If you could state your name, your preferred pronouns, and any identifiers that help to make the session more accessible. So what you're wearing, it goes into our transcript and just makes it more accessible for everyone. And then if you could also please share a little bit about your organization or the movement that you're involved with. So Monica, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Oh, Monica, I think you're on mute.
Peace and blessings, everyone. My name is Monica Lewis-Patrick. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the president and CEO of We the People of Detroit. My pronouns are she and her. And right now I am wearing a gray shirt and I think it may match very nicely with my gray afro. And then our work is really deeply rooted in the human right to water, around civil rights, around the democratic process. It's also deeply connected to making sure that citizens are engaged, trained, and mobilized to be a part of their own liberation. And so we, I think, are most noted for working on water, but we work on water, land, education, and housing. And we see all of those themes deeply connected. So looking forward to the conversation this morning.
Thank you, Monica. John, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon now. My name is John Sloan. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a darker skinned Black man with a beard, wearing a blue button-up shirt. and some blue light glasses to protect my eyes and keep me from getting headaches. So I am just privileged to be one of the co-lead organizers for the Detroit chapter of Black Lives Matter. We are connected to the BLM grassroots organization, the larger global network. Here in Detroit, we work really hard not to replicate and try to reinvent any wheels. Detroit has an amazing history of activism and of activist organizations. And we like to focus our work in a few different specific areas. Obviously around policy and supporting and working towards Proposal P and those initiatives for the charter, but also in education. Last year, we were able to give out over 1,500 backpacks filled with school supplies to students across Detroit. And we have that same goal for this coming school year. We work around food sovereignty, partnering with groups like Keep Growing Detroit to provide 400 or 500 boxes, community-supported agriculture boxes across the city. And so we believe that the valuing of Black life has to exist across a lot of areas. Generally, when people think about BLM, they think about the concept of policing. And the demilitarization of the police force. We are absolutely a police abolitionist organization, but we also believe in building up systems, right? That can take the place of those other arcane, dated systems. We don't believe that the system in and of itself is broken. It's working exactly how it was designed and intended to work to benefit the individuals it was designed and intended to benefit. And so we're here to build up systems in its place that can push those out of the way and make them less relevant. So thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here and to contribute to this panel. And go blue, hail to the victors. I went to Michigan, so I'm always excited to participate.
Thanks so much, John. Art, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Hey, folks, it's really good to be a part of the conversation with you all. My name is Reyes III. I use he and him. I have what my mom tells me is very nice black hair, a beard. I'm wearing a teal sweatshirt with a small Michigan outline, and a lot of my staff likes to poke fun at me for always wearing things that have the state of Michigan or the Great Lakes on them. So I lead an organization called We the People Michigan, and we work to build multiracial working class organizing capacity across the state, really focused on building proactive vision of the type of communities and state that we deserve, and fighting over time for the governing power required to enact that vision. So our work is rooted in working in working class communities from the Upper Peninsula, where we work very deeply in rural communities and indigenous communities, to Southeast Michigan, partnering and working very closely with folks in places like Detroit and Flint, and also kind of working across the west side of the state from Traverse City down to Benton Harbor. Our focus is on organizing, and this was a really important fight that we supported in, and really looked to the leadership of organizations like We the People of Detroit, Mama Monica, Detroit People's Platform, and Linda Campbell, and a number of folks who were leading there. One of the roles I know we'll dig into a little bit that for us is important is constantly pulling out and being very clear about not only what are the fights that we have to engage in, but also who are some of the actors that are often invisible, that are holding power to set agenda, and oftentimes are exercising incredible amounts of power over elected officials and decision makers. And so we played a hand in doing some of the research and narrative around that in particular, because it was not isolated. The folks who were in opposition to Proposal P are often also in opposition to many of the fights in many of our communities right now. It's very important that we make what is often invisible visible to our communities. So we'll share a little bit more about that later, but really honored to be on this panel talking about this really important and critical issue with some folks that were dug in very, very deeply and leading.
Thank you so much, Art. And yeah, I am excited to dive a little bit deeper into this issue. So, why don't we start with what was Proposal P? And I can give some background information for those who may not know, but I want to hear from the panelists first. And any of you can take this question.
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button. So what is Proposal P? I think there's a larger existential question that I want to ask myself when I sit down and think about that. But the most direct answer is it was a proposal that was on up for vote that would have been amended the Detroit City Charter, right? So if you think about the city charter akin to the Constitution, then we have the opportunity to offer amendments to that charter. And this was a process that was years in the making. Whereas Detroiters, we elected commissioners whose job it was to, comb through the thousands of proposals that were sent to them. One of those proposals was the Detroiters Bill of Rights, which I had the opportunity to work on with Councilmember Lopez, who can't be here today. And that was put up to offerings for us as a community to vote on and to be able to hopefully make some very powerful changes for the city.
So to be clear, John, so the city charter kind of acts as a blueprint for the city, or the Constitution defines the powers and organization of local government.
Yeah, and where money moves, right, and how it is allotted between different departments.
That's an important part of it.
And Aisha, just to build on to what John just so eloquently shared, it also was a response from the community to the thwarting of democracy and emergency management and policies that were enacted under that austerity still playing out today. So this was the people's response to having government and constitutional protections set aside by both sides of the aisle. It has been something that has been definitely racially applied across Michigan. And I will put in the chat, there is even recent research that was done by Dr. Sarah Hughes at the University of Michigan that validated that the activists had told us over a decade ago that emergency management was being weaponized against working families and families of color all across Michigan. And it was being used as a way to seize assets and carve up union contracts.
Wow. Wow. So exacerbating racial disparities and the ongoing legacy of emergency management. Art, do you want to jump in here at all?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what Mama Monica just said, and I want to build on that. I think what we experienced was a really devastating attack on democracy with the emergency management law. Efforts like Proposal P are really critical for folks rising up against that. But I think it's important too to take a look at when we think about emergency management and we think about that incredible fight that folks waged there. It was also rooted in a couple of really problematic narratives that we allowed to seep in more broadly in the state, despite many folks of color, working class folks, and activists fighting against that. But those narratives were, one, that it was too expensive to pay union contracts, to pay pensioners what they were owed, and that our resources should not be put into that we were bloated and inefficient, and that needed to be cut. That was one of the arguments that placed financial arguments over human need. The other one that was really critical that we watched play out is the narrative that says Black and brown people cannot govern themselves. And that is what we saw in places in Detroit and Flint, where I grew up, in Benton Harbor, where the fight continues in a number of other places in majority Black cities that had democracy ripped out from underneath folks. And so like this isn't an isolated issue. Proposal P wasn't outside of all of that context.
Right.
This was community reclaiming these attacks that had been sustained over a number of years. And those attacks led to devastating outcomes, right? Devastating outcomes. As somebody who grew up in Flint, I know that's a very public, now the water crisis that people understand as being rooted in the emergency management law and in thwarting democracy. But many communities were dismantled through the emergency management law. And efforts like Proposal P are communities reclaiming power and saying that's actually not the systems that we want to be living within. So I think it's really important to understand that in that context that Mama Monica was laying out for us, because it is important. There's a lot of fights over the long term that we have to be anchoring in a number of communities across the state to reclaim much of the devastation wrought by these very intense anti-democratic measures, namely within the emergency management law.
And I think we've got to even go a little bit deeper than that. We've got to talk about and start to name the corporate and political and even university actors. Because if you look at what happened in Detroit, there were philanthropic interests and some property and land interests that allowed corporate actors and the universities and different community leadership voices to unite in solidarity with emergency management. And so even now, what you're seeing is many people are being deeply silent on the fact that they played a co-collaborative role in the austerity that is playing out in our communities. So to act as though, you don't see what you see or know what you know, also to me is making some of these persons complicit in what is playing out right now. And so when you look at the banks that were protected, there's an article called The Water Banker Barons. Many of the banks that were protected during the bankruptcy in the city of Detroit are the same banks that are buying up the aquifers around the globe. So these things are not happening in isolation. When you look at some of the captains of industry that are celebrated, not only in the city of Detroit, but all across the state of Michigan for their investments, we leave out the fact that many of them are able to do the kind of investments they're doing on the backs of working class families that actually saw their pension funds raided and the loss of healthcare to the tune of 50% of the healthcare for the workers of the city of Detroit actually was lost to them, while you saw 80% of the bankruptcy levied on their backs. So not to connect the dots of these things, we do a disservice not only to each other, but also to the movement, not to help those dots be connected.
Absolutely. It's so important that you guys all connected this for us and to how this didn't just come out of a vacuum, right? Proposal B. There's been a long legacy of racism, of corporate interests that have benefited off the city, and this was the people's response. So I just want to quickly clear up for some people who may not know what Proposal P is. So it was on the August primary on the ballot, and it was a proposal to revise Detroit's city charter, which the city charter kind of functions as the constitution for a city. Defines the powers, the procedures. Ultimately, voters voted no, so they did not want to change the city charter, and we'll get to why. And also kind of the ongoing work that's still happening around these issues. But if the charter had been changed, it would have, there was over 100 different changes that it would have addressed, from crumbling sidewalks, water shutoffs, recycling programs, affordable housing, things that really were impacted and still are impacted from emergency management. There would have been broad reforms to, I think there would have been 47 new elected positions created, 102 new appointed positions created, and it would have diluted a little bit of the strong mayor system that exists in Detroit. So not surprisingly, those that were opposed to it included Mayor Duggan, as well as some other individuals. And then some of the main actors behind the proposal were City Councilwoman Raquel Castaneda-Lopez, the People's Charter for a Better Detroit, Prop P campaign, many others, including the individuals on this call. So I just wanted to clarify that for anyone who on this call may still not understand what Proposal P was. So given that, why don't we talk a little bit about how your organizations were involved in the movement to get Proposal P on the ballot? What were you hearing from people? Why did this issue need to go up for a vote? And anyone feel free to jump in here.
Sure, I can start. So on the BLM Detroit side, we really got involved with Councilmember Castaneda-Lopez and working on one collaborative offerance to the commission called the Detroiters Bill of Rights. And the Detroiters Bill of Rights spelled out rights across several levels: right to safety, right to recreation, right to water, right to housing, transportation, that we were working on, that we offered to the Charter Commission, that were then included in all or in part, but generally all into Proposal P. As part of BLM, we worked most exclusively on the right to safety, on what the demilitarization of DPD could look like, on what it means to ban the use of biological and chemical warfare like tear gas, and that use against residents of Detroit on the ability to kind of to separate DPD from the 1033 program, which is a pipeline from DOJ, the federal government Department of Justice, that provides military grade equipment directly to local law enforcement agencies. And so those were, and against surveillance, right? So Project Greenlight, I think, is what everybody thinks about most initially when they think about surveillance. And so those were the areas that we put in a lot of work and emphasis into the Detroiters Bill of Rights, making sure that those got into Proposal P and kind of stayed ratified through. The one thing I do want to say, and stop me if I'm jumping too far ahead, but when we start talking about why Proposal P ended up not getting the type of support that I think we all wanted to see, we have to also talk about the opposition that it received, in particular from the governor's office, and how detrimental that was, and how people that voted for the governor, felt, and I'm speaking for myself, betrayed in a lot of ways by the letter that was written and by the disparity between the actual analysis from the Attorney General and the letter that the governor offered. Because if you read both of those documents, they're not really aligned, right? And so as we start thinking through the ways that we participate in our system and how we support elected officials, I think it's important. I personally think it's important to vote. I also think it's important just because I voted for you one time doesn't mean that you now all of a sudden have all of my support, regardless of whether or not you're showing up for me in that space. And so as Proposal P kept on moving through, as the Detroiters Bill of Rights and this piece got added, and that we knew was going to go on legislation, it was really, we felt like it was our responsibility to support as much as possible the education of what was actually in the bill. It was big. There was a lot to it, right? And I think a lot of people ended up, unfortunately, people are busy. Like, we have lives, we have kids, we have families, we have jobs. And so it's unrealistic sometimes to expect somebody to be able to go through and read the entire thing. And so part of our job as members of the community is to be able to say, this is what's in this. This is why it's important. This is what it addresses.
And just building on what John just laid out, I think for us too, it was about connecting some of that historical work to a right now moment of being able to move from this constant place of trauma into transformation. So work that we really have connected with that is rooted in legendary work like People's Water Board and Michigan Welfare Rights, and our mentor and one of our leaders, the Honorable Councilwoman Joanne Watson. We had to really remind our family in Detroit that you are not foreign to these moments of where you have been the leader and the architect of transformation. And so really using the water work that those women have seeded and are the architects of, we the people of Detroit took it as a moment to be able to not only support ushering in new leadership through the charter into the city residents of Detroit, but it actually was an opportunity to also codify within the charter the human right to water, a health in all policy framework, and then really move the needle on water affordability. As John talked about, these were some very lengthy days and nights. Thank God for the leadership of the Honorable City Councilwoman Lopez, because she really shepherded this process of bringing all of these brilliant minds together and then taking the work that had been done at an amazing level individually, and then bringing it all to one table to really leverage the power of the moment. And so it was not only the brilliance of being able to convene all of these bright minds, but it also was seizing the moment to really take the community beyond being victimized and the master narrative, the last one out of Detroit, cut the lights off, but really talking about this innovation that Detroiters are known for, not only in Detroit, but all across the world. And so I'm super excited because we had national leaders all across the country, specifically on water, on those calls, sitting and listening and noting the leadership and the brilliance that was happening in those moments.
Wow. Dr. Trina Shanks, you have your hand up. Do you want to jump in here and ask a question?
Yeah, quick question. So I attended a couple of presentations on the Detroiters Bill of Rights, and it was very detailed, and I was very impressed with all of the thoughtful work that went into it. and this might be moving us too far ahead, so Aisha, you could tell me to wait. But I think one of the brilliant pieces of that, in addition to having the total package, which is the Detroiters Bill of Rights, which is also part of the Proposal P package, it also had a lot of individual bills that might still be able to be passed. And so I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that. One, is that a good strategy? And then two, where some of those individual bills are going, even if the entire Proposal P wasn't passed in August.
That's a great question. And whoever decides to respond, if you could also just briefly kind of explain what was Detroit Bill of Rights for those who may not know. Feel free to jump in, anyone.
Go ahead, Mama. Look like you were about to say something. I will defer.
I thought you were gonna go, John.
In this conversation, I'm going to give up all the space to the wisdom. So feel free.
Well, definitely you and Art jump in, but I think what we really pose to do is to center most impacted community, most disenfranchised, marginalized community members, and bring that value system into a policy drafting moment. And so what you see is the work that many groups, as Art stated, People's Water Board and Michigan Welfare Rights and Detroit People's Platform, and just all of these formations that have been seriously digging deep into issues of transit justice, disability justice, human rights, water justice, utility justice, anti-racism, and being able to root those out of the policy making and how people are even chosen for elected positions. And then demystifying the fact that, emergency management is still playing out. And so we really had to use whatever democratic process at our disposal to take back power. And so what you see happening is people really taking a human and justice lens to policy drafting, and then doing it in a way that took work that had already been seeded and nurtured in Detroit and bringing it together in a unified voice to say that these are the policies, these are the values that we hold dear. And if we will center these things in terms of contracts and training, jobs and opportunities, we do believe that Detroit can come back. And so this is moving beyond this manufactured narrative of comeback to the realities that we are facing in our community, which is that many people are being left out and they are not a part of this comeback. And then it also was a moment their fault because the goal of blaming Detroiters for failed leadership, as Art talked about, only crafting that around Black and Brown leadership, mind you, but then also using those narratives to weaponize disenfranchising folks from things that they should have constitutional protections for. And so we've had to demystify, we've had to debunk, but then to me, the People's Bill of Rights was the beginning point of anchoring the value of the residents in policymaking. And that's what those policies are rooted in, is a health and all policy framework, from everything from food to housing to water to land to even how contracts are vetted. And I think the other thing we were able to do is to actually give a dollar amount. We put a value on those particular services so that people could understand, as we were talking about defunding the police, we were also talking about funding your neighbors and your friends and your families for a better quality of life.
And if I could, I should build on what Mama Monica said. The analog is really, if we talk about the city charter, akin to the Constitution, right? One of the first things that the founders of this country did, and I use that word very loosely, is they wrote a Bill of Rights. The very first thing they did is say, oh, wait a minute, this Constitution that we just wrote actually wasn't accurate. There were actually things in there that we forgot to include that we need to add. Here are these amendments that we are going to offer. And under the leadership of Councilmember Castaneda-Lopez, a bunch of organizations came together all across Southeastern Michigan, all across the state, really, that had impact and knowledge about how to affect these different issues, and put together one comprehensive piece that said, great, we are going to offer our own Bill of Rights to amend this city charter. And that included a lot of the things that Monica just mentioned, and also assigned them a barometer right? So in a lot of instances, we would say, look, we're not asking for anything more than these other entities like the UN, like the World Health Organization, have deemed human beings are deserving of, right? I'm thinking about that in specific when we think about the use of tear gas and biological weaponry that the UN has said should not be used during times of war, but that DPD uses against residents during protest actions. We're thinking about what it means to have oversight, what it means to have had a police chief who is also appointed to be the vice mayor, and the conflict of interest that can occur when, you know, who is then providing that check or balance. And so the Bill of Rights was put together by a lot of different organizations that all have core competencies in those certain areas. To the question that Professor Shanks asked also, is it possible then to partition off segments of that and offer them up individually? I think so. I think part of the reason that there was such a large lift in education for Proposal P was because of the depth and breadth of that piece of legislation, was because in many ways, when we would do door knocking, we could say, well, no, Proposal P includes water, it includes safety, it includes surveillance, it includes housing, it includes transportation. All of that is true. There is also, I think, a communications philosophy that says sometimes it's easier to talk about one thing. Sometimes it's easier to say when you're voting against Proposal P, you're voting against the fair fare. You're voting against the ability to equitably allow Detroiters to get on the public transit, such as it is, and to have equitable access to that thing. And that sometimes I think is an easier leveraging point. It was very easy for opponents of Proposal P just to put up billboards that say P is a problem. It's going to send us back into bankruptcy without actually doing the work to talk to you about why they were opposing things. The last thing I'll say before we move on is I think it's interesting to note that a lot of the opponents, when you broke out the individual aspects of Proposal P, said they were in favor of them. They're like, oh, I think water should be a right. Oh, I think people should have equitable access to transportation. Oh, I think there should be. But when you put them all in one bill, the opposition that they offered, it was in many ways nonsensical. The city offered a budget projection, and they said, this is what Proposal P can do. And if you scroll through and read the entire thing, you get to the last 2 pages, and every dollar amount is $4 million, $4 million, $4 million, $4 million, $4 million, as if they didn't think that we were going to read the thing. And that if we did read it, as if they didn't think we were intelligent enough to comprehend the fact, they just started offering random assessments, right, without any sort of backing. When the report that came out of MSU, and this is the only time I'll give Michigan State any sort of love, but the report that came out of MSU actually offered a much more reasonable assessment of the cost-benefit analysis of Proposal P, including also potential revenue that would be brought in by a lot of the suggestions and the amendments to that Constitution. So when we start talking about why this actually didn't pass on the ballot, we also have to talk about the framing of these issues and who has the loudest microphone when it comes to how we're talking about and who to the communities to whom we're communicating.
Such important points.
Yeah, I super appreciate that. I think it's really important to lift, and Proposal P obviously was an incredibly visionary, aspirational. The frame of it was aspirational, and I think that's incredibly important. I think allows a lot of room for fights. And one of the people on our team at the time, our policy director Gabby Santiago Romero, who was a part of many of these conversations. Who's now a candidate for Detroit City Council in District 6, where Raquel, Councilwoman Castaneda-Lopez is stepping down. It's important that we have young movement leaders that are willing to actually carry out this fight on the inside too, within the council. And one thing that I just wanted to kind of quickly come back to that Mama Monica was saying, that I just think it's such an incredibly important point. Aisha, I did drop a few slides because I'm not sure how. I know some folks are very, very familiar with the emergency management law and the how that went down, but I think it's helpful as a primer to also understand Prop P in the broader context of the state, about a fight that is rooted in what this looks like and means to have working class people, to have Black folks, Indigenous folks, other folks of color actually standing into power against a set of corporate and wealthy actors. And if you don't mind, I'd just love to give folks a very quick thing on that, because I think that explains for us where some of that ties in on the financial fight. That is also an important part to understanding our opposition and how they're moving. So I just want to show folks a few slides quickly that
yeah, absolutely. Just to let you know, it doesn't look like it's updating on my end. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop screen share, and then I'm going to get your slides. Just
Okay.
FYI.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's extremely important to understand it in the context of emergency management. Right?
Yeah, let me give. I can just start giving a quick primer while that's kind of getting sorted out. I think one of the things that for us we use a lot as we're thinking about kind of the broader work from a 30,000 foot view, we use a little bit of political theory called the three faces of power. It's some theory rooted in written by Stephen M. Lukes a number of years ago. I think it's a really powerful framework. But the first face of power asks the question, like, who decides? And when we look at the emergency management law, it was March 16th, 2011, when Governor Snyder signed Public Act 4 into law after it passed the House and the Senate, despite massive protests that were happening at the time. Like, this passed into law. But the people actually had a massive uprising around that. So that year on the ballot, many folks, Mama Monica was one of them, a number of folks across the state said, this law is fundamentally undemocratic. We want to repeal this, and did. And actually on the ballot won. So November 6th, 2012, right, what we saw was that voters across the state had struck down Public Act 4 through a referendum at the ballot, 53% to 47%. In Detroit, that number was 82% to 18%. Detroit showed up to say this is a fundamentally undemocratic law that is about silencing Black folks and ripping democracy away from Black cities. There's a picture there that I really love when you can see it of Mama Monica celebrating that victory on that night. But so this is important because the people actually said this law is unjust, it's undemocratic, like we don't want this. But shortly thereafter, about a month and a half later, about 40 days later, December 26th, so the day after Christmas, during lame duck that year, Governor Snyder signed Public Act 436 into law after it passed the House and the Senate on the cover of darkness during lame duck. And what that did was just slightly modify the emergency management law so that it tweaked Public Act 4 and it added a $30,000 appropriation that then made it referendum proof. So then said, no longer can the people decide to repeal this law via referendum because now it has an appropriation behind it. So now it's referendum proof. They simply repassed it. So what that did is that kept the emergency management regime in place for Detroit Public Schools, for Ecorse, for Benton Harbor, for Pontiac, for Flint, for Highland Park Schools, for Muskegon Heights, for Allen Park. All of these, they kept the emergency management regime. Without that, for me, this is very, very personal because without that decision happening, the Flint water crisis never happens. It never happens. What happens then is it was the emergency manager that decided to make the switch, that decided we're going to go to the Flint River, that caused all of that. So these decisions of who decides really matter in that first phase. But the second phase of power, asking the question, well, who sets the agenda, is also fundamental. That matters deeply. And if the slides are working on, this is slide 11.
Yeah, sorry about that. My computer's froze, so I've had a team member who is trying to get it up.
No problem. I think the important thing, like on then what this looks like, this second phase of power, is that Public Act 4 wasn't like some random idea of people like, oh, let's do this thing because it'll help with financial help. It was written by the Mackinac Policy Center, which is a right-wing free market think tank in Michigan that's played a role in attacking unions and attacking environmental protections and privatizing schools and privatizing prisons. Like, they're awful. And they are funded by some of the wealthiest folks in Michigan and in the country, the DeVosses, the Prince family, the Koch family, the Waltons. They're also funded by major corporations, Dow, ExxonMobil, GM, Donor Trust, which is a front organization that's funded by a lot of large corporations and right-wing folks. So when we see that, like, these are the agenda setters that are putting incredible amounts of money at attacking working class people, Black and brown folks, at undermining our democracy. And the third question we have to ask is, well, what's the dominant narrative and who benefits? So I want to, there's Mama Monica there celebrating. And, in this, the last thing that I want to say is this is on slide 12. I don't know for folks here, for students, for academics, and folks have heard about the Overton window, which is often kind of used in political theory. Well, the Overton window is named after Joseph Overton, senior vice president at the Mackinac Policy Center. He's the one who coined the term. And what the term means is saying, how do we shift the Overton window from taking an idea that seems unthinkable to most people and shifting that to make it seem reasonable and popular? And so what they did with this is chipped away through a narrative that was constantly attacking, especially Black leadership in cities, that was constantly saying, like, we can't afford to be paying pensions and union wages, as if that's the problem, as opposed to wealthy folks hoarding resources. That successfully shifted, especially for our political leaders, including Democrats, who are awful. If you go back and look at the transcripts in the legislature about the implementation of emergency management, they were just as much of the problem. That shifted a very radical idea that said, let's rip away democratic power from municipalities and school boards and say, you don't get to decide. These decisions need to be made through a financial lens by folks that are not accountable to you. And they shifted the Overton window on this. And so what that happened, that was playing upon the two narratives that said, like, we're bloated and that Black and brown people cannot govern themselves, that shifted all of this. So the reason I think that's important for folks to understand and get like some of that analysis is because this is a continuation of that fight. That Prop P is a clapback on it, that's aspirational, but the same actors that fought on emergency management, that worked to strip our democratic rights, are the same actors then that are fighting on this right now. One of the things that we did, and we can go into this in more detail later, but as soon as it's a habit that I've developed over the years, is as soon as campaign finance reports are due into the state, I go through and I comb through and I look. And the biggest donors in opposition publicly to Prop P were DTE, the largest investor-owned utility in the state, and Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. Those were the two largest donors in opposition of Prop P. Now, those were two that did not weigh in at all. DTE is not shy about weighing in city council meetings. They didn't weigh in at all on any of this. This is about control, and it's about making sure that they're dominating politics. There was a dark money operation, again, that we can talk about later, that was actually the ones that had all the billboards, that we have no idea who contributed to it, how much money they spent. It's likely hundreds of thousands of dollars over about a 2-month period. And I'm happy to share some of that research a bit later. But this was a dark money operation that was playing on those same narratives, on the pain and fear that people had as a result of all of these undemocratic actions that had happened previously, especially older folks, pensioners, retirees, who saw the pain, who experienced the pain of what it was look like to have investment companies and creditors prioritized over their families and over the work that they had put in for decades. And so all they had to say was Prop P is a problem. They didn't say vote no on Prop P because that would have made it illegal for them to not show the money. They didn't say vote no on Prop P because that would have triggered disclosure. We would have to, we'd then get the ability to see who donated. We didn't get that. They stayed within those lines, and they preyed upon this narrative and the pain that people had experienced of what it felt like to lose something that you had fought for and earned. And so they played upon that. So people said, no way, I can't lose that again. And when we were on doors talking about the aspiration of what was happening, every single person I talked to, and I was on doors a lot leading up to the election day on Prop P, every single person we talked to when learning about what Prop P was incredibly supportive. When you asked them if they knew what Prop P was, they were just confused. And that was the point of all of the commercials and the billboards and the radio. That was the point. And so it's really important for us to understand not this as an isolated issue or a ballot initiative happening in Detroit. It's important, but this is a part of a broader fight that we're engaged in this state about who gets to decide. Is it working class people, folks in our communities, Black and brown folks in Detroit and Flint and elsewhere? Or is it corporate actors that have dominated the agenda, a governing agenda, for far too long in this state? And that's a fundamental question that Prop P was challenging, and it scared the shit out of folks. It scared the shit out of some of these folks who are agenda setters. That's why opposition was so intense and fierce around that. I'll stop there, but I just want to make sure to contextualize some of the history around this and where it's connected.
That's amazing.
And I think too, we've just got to add this critical point, Art, is that not only the work that has happened from community to sound these alarms, but it has been community-driven science and data and research and policy building that continues to center community. Because if we continue to talk about this issue as though the people lost, the people didn't lose Proposal P. Proposal P was thwarted by corporate and dirty money. That's what happened with Proposal P. And Proposal P also sounded the alarm on a national level, because you not only have emergency management and these austerity measures playing out in Michigan, you have 37 states across the nation that already have some form of this legislation already on the books. So we are fighting a monster that is quickly growing multiple arms and legs, and that is well funded. So you also have to include connecting the dots to the fact that you've got many Black men that profess to be Democrats that served as emergency managers. Right now, even today, you have many of them cleaning up their past bad actions by being moved into other positions of leadership and power, either under the Duggan administration or under President Joe Biden's administration. So some of them are moving into federal roles that were part of the suppression and the divestment that happened in Detroit and all across Michigan. And so you can't sort of wipe it away with sort of funding this part of it and not acknowledging the other parts of it. Detroit, for all intents and purposes, Flint and all of these Black and brown communities are still under the oppression of emergency management. When Dan Gilbert can get over $618 million in school aid fund from the children of Detroit, but then at the same time, the narrative is that Black parents don't care about Black children. But then you have universities coming in and they too are participating in charterizing public education in Detroit. Then we have to help our family connect those dots. And many of the universities that we root for on Saturday are co-conspirators with stealing these assets Monday through Saturday. So I'm going to add some more articles in the chat, because I need for the students to connect the dots that they have to call these inequities out even in their own institutions.
John, did you want to jump in?
There's nothing that I would have to add that wouldn't be a reiteration. The one thing that I would say is I think a lot of what you're hearing from us today is that the narratives that we're getting through popular media, through public, are often very surface level and are often driven intentionally by actors that have agendas. And so then the important thing that we have to do is investigate, and are laid out beautifully, right, that the connections between the two, but also not fall into the trap of thinking that all these instances are isolated, that all these are siloed off, right? But recognizing the web that connects everything.
Yeah, like a strategic, concerted effort with corporate interests, people who want to basically suppress Black and brown community power and benefit, right?
It's intentional. It's intentional. Yeah. I'm sorry to cut you off. Like racialized capitalism, it supports a hierarchy, right? In the same way that we talk about the current system of policing not being there to prevent, to maintain safety. It's there to maintain social order, right? To keep people that already have that, allowing them to still accrue. And that can only be done by these dominant narratives being proliferated.
So I guess I would ask next, or Art, I'm sorry, did you want to jump in there? I guess I would ask next. So it sounds like there was this concerted effort, this campaign to chip away at the narrative. If Proposal P was going to be on the ballot again in the future, would it, please ignore the slides, everyone. Would it, how would the narrative change? Will it be on the ballot in a different way? As Trina said, maybe, these smaller legislations within the proposal might be on it separately. Where do you all stand with that?
I think an important thing for folks to know just about the way that the charter is oriented in Detroit is this isn't something that you can just be like, all right, let's get it back up on there, right? This is a process that happens every 16 years. And so what happens then is that it triggers an election, like what happened in 2018, that says, do we want to revisit the charter or not? Folks voted in favor of revisiting the charter, and then a charter commission is then elected. And then they have those 2 years to work on the charter revisions, and then it's put to a vote of the people. It's not a standard ballot initiative that's just like, hey, let's do this again. It's the revision of the charter is baked into the process in the city. And so this is something that window that happens that's baked in. It's a process that happens every 16 years, not every year. So like that, I think it's an important thing to understand. Now, there's a lot of opportunity to do a lot of proactive things, but I just wanted to lift up like what is baked into the charter and when that is revisited, because that's built into the.
It's not an every election possibility, is what you're saying.
But to help give the family some historical context, you've got to remind them that the charter was opened up early. So as they were laying the groundwork to begin the contrived bankruptcy that happened in Detroit, part of what happened is that you had legislative and corporate actors actually fund an opening of the charter earlier in the process. So many things that were done that actually allowed DTE to seize control and be gifted with Detroit lighting and lighting department. That was a handing over of hundreds of millions of dollars of assets that allowed DTE during a financial downturn of 2008 into 2010 and 12 to be able to recoup some of their dollars off the backs of Detroiters. It also allowed them to seize a $2 billion asset in the Detroit Water and Sewage Department and not pay a dime for it. We're actually leasing, sharecropping back from ourselves access to our own water department when we actually could be generating about $38 million a year in revenue. So when we don't put those calculations on the table, then it allows Mr. Duggan to go about the country claiming as though he's fixing water inequities and injustices when he's actually exacerbated them. And what he is doing is positioning more of the county to be able to come into the city of Detroit and take over contracts. So if we don't talk about it in terms of actually equity and justice, in terms of not only the legislative process, but also the economic engines that create jobs and contracts and opportunities locally, this too is raiding the coffers of the residents of Detroit. And so this was another point that we wanted to make in crafting this legislation. It wasn't just about protecting the democratic rights of Detroiters. It was about creating an economic engine so that Detroiters could stay in their homes and stay in their city.
That's such an important point. Sonia, you have a question in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and let me unmute you? Or maybe you can unmute yourself and ask it. Let's see. Or I can go ahead and ask it for you as well. So Sonia's question was, can you share your vision of what governance should look like and what we can work towards? Like if there was an equitable representative government in Detroit, what would that really look like to you?
I mean, I think one of the things that Proposal P was very strongly centered around, as was the Detroit's Bill of Rights, was this idea of centering governance inside of communities, right? And removing the decision making from these actors that you know where we don't have line of sight as to who these individuals are, where there's money that's flowing in. What's to me the most frustrating about this Proposal P is exactly what I mentioned. Like this is something that's triggered every 16 years. This is part of the process. This is something that we go through as a community. And this is something that is offered up by Detroiters for Detroiters. And for it to have been met with such vitriol, I think speaks to how fearful individuals were about the effects that legislation could make and could bring into the community. I think about a very clear example when we think about the Board of Police Commissioners, right, just as one example, the fact that when you have to offer a grievance, you have to go to inside of the police department because that's where they meet. When an officer is put up for a promotion, the Board of Police Commissioners is not allowed to consider anything in their history as an officer that might have been detrimental, that might have been any sort of reprimands. Those types of things were what was included in the Detroit Bill of Rights, were what's included in the in Proposal P. And what those things do is they add balance. They center the ability to govern our community in our community. And so it's not framing governance within the city of Detroit in terms of hierarchy as much anymore. So, I mean, I think it's a broad question, but what I think it's important to do is by centering the individuals that are the most marginalized, right? If that's the guiding principle, then we end up affecting powerful change for the rest of us as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great point. Dr. Trina Shanks, you put in the chat, as one of the national organizations partner with the Color of Change.
We have done work with the Color of Change. They had a conference here in Detroit, I want to say 3 years ago now, when it was still COBO. We don't partner with them directly, but we do engage with them when opportunities present themselves.
The reason I ask is they do a really good job of connecting all the dots along the way. So it's not just one campaign, but it's how it fits in this larger picture. Just wanted to ask that question. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. What would you recommend to young leaders who wish to do work similar to what you all do? Question.
Yeah, I'll dive in first. I think the most important thing is there are not kind of barriers or applications with it. This is doing the work of helping to fight for your community is something that everybody can do. And in part, what I think it looks like in the immediate sense is just beginning to get plugged in with organizations, participate in some of the actions that you're seeing, and begin just digging in. I think so long as folks kind of show up with curiosity and fire in their belly and are ready to do the work, we need many more people, everyday folks engaged in this work constantly. And so what I would say is, there's resources here, there's 3 organizations here that we can share there, but many. And I think it's important to ask who's doing work in your community that aligns with your values, and show up and just start showing up for folks. That is incredibly important right now, and we need to make sure that there aren't barriers to that. And I know for sure at times it can feel like there are. I think especially sometimes, especially in campus communities. I was a working class kid who went to University of Michigan. And when I first showed up in Ann Arbor, I was very overwhelmed. I was a part of, at the time, there was I don't think it's around anymore, but an organization called SOUL, Students Organizing for Labor and Economic Equality, that I joined. And it was for me, I was the only one who went who was a kid of factory workers. And I went, and it was like people's concept of what that meant to fight for that meant something totally different than what my experience had been. And it required being able to ask some questions and learn and have a bit of a learning mentality. It also required us to push organizations to be accessible to folks in our community. That if we actually want to be changing these things, what we can't be building is social clubs with coded language that you have to use in order to be on the in. We have to be building mass people's organizations where everybody is welcome to come in and fight. And that means, they got to learn along the way too. But we need to learn what it looks like to create space for mass people's movements, not inaccessible social clubs. And at times we learn those habits in some places, especially at elite universities like the University of Michigan. So just want to put that out there too, but just dive in, show up, build relationships, talk to people, ask questions.
don't make movements elite, right? That's a feature of capitalism. And also something that you guys have all emphasized during this talk is centering the experiences and centering the voices of people affected by the problems in making a solution, right? We don't go into communities and tell individuals affected by problems what the solution is, because people are competent and intelligent and they know. Any other advice? And also any other questions from the audience? Well, I want to just thank you all because, oh, Monica, jump in.
Just we want to list some of the lessons learned from our elders. One of the things that the Honorable Councilwoman Joanne Watson told us over a decade ago, that no one was coming to save poor Black and brown folks, that we had to deputize ourselves. And that part of that deputizing meant that through cooperative work and self-determination that we collectively save ourselves. And so we just love to lift her voice in this space. And then definitely recognizing too that all gifts are needed. You'd be amazed that even some of the things you do as a hobby can become an important part of movement building work. And so just want to let folks know that there is a place for everyone in this work. And then I also see Mike Shane. So I don't know if we can get Mike's voice in.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
I started a comment in the chat, but there's another aspect of the bankruptcy which needs to be raised. It's very important. Kevin Orr, along with Dan Gilbert and Mayor Duggan and Governor Snyder, went to the Obama administration to have the hardest hit funds, which were initially just set up. Michigan got $750 million to rescue people's homes that were in both bank and tax foreclosures. Instead, they redirected them to the Blight Authority, which was stupid. It really was stupid, because when you use the funds to pay off people's property tax arrearages, the funds for the most part come to the city of Detroit anyway, and they could have torn down homes that were blighted. Instead, the process that Duggan used accelerated the blight, continued to result in the overtaxation of Detroiters on property taxes. And we still see today that what he has done is double the cost of tearing down a home, while at the same time not stopping the hemorrhages of quality homes in Detroit. So we're still paying for that as well. I wanted to bring that up because moratorium now, we did actually meet with MISHDA on several occasions to try to reverse that, because we called it the double tap of the hardest hit funds. First, you save people's homes, then you let the city council decide how to spend the money. And that's what Duggan did not want. The money would have been controlled by the city council, at least nominally. They could have used it to tear down structures, or they could have used it for services for the people. But we need to think about that as well. There was so much corruption in the use of the blight, with the Blight Authority, I should say, that the Special Inspector General of TARP funds, SIG-TARP, was conducting investigations into all the corruption in the Blight Authority. And I'm not sure if they ever came up with anything that could put people in jail, but Duggan and his cronies should have gone to jail for the misuse of the funds. I just wanted to throw that in there on the hardest hit funds. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you know, Detroit homeowners are some of the most overtaxed in the state. We know that. Property assessments are completely, you know, ambiguous. Do any of you want to jump in on anything that was just said? And then I think we have another question from PG Watkins. Hey, PG, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hey, y'all. What up, though? So as someone who organizes in the city, but generally like a younger organizer, right? I've been organizing for years, but still not a very, very long time. I'm always hungry for more shared lessons from campaigns like this, right? Like I remember when Raquel brought us all together initially for the Detroiters Bill of Rights, but I didn't necessarily see it all the way through to the end of the Proposal P fight. But I'm like, that trajectory, the campaign that y'all built and went through, even though it was a loss, like we didn't necessarily see full victory in that, is such an important thing for young organizers to hear about, to learn from, right? To see as like a case study of sorts of how to build this type of campaign. And so I'm curious if y'all have done any thinking about how to share those lessons, or like what are you thinking about how to like pass along some of the learnings and processes that y'all did during this campaign?
Well, I know there's been multiple layers of debriefing that's happened. And I know that many of those debriefings have been multi-organizational, intergenerational. So I do believe that that learning and that sharing is happening. And I don't believe it's just one way. I think we as elders are also evolving in our understanding of this is not our grandmother and our mother's social movement. That many of the tactics that we use in terms of, filling up jails and courthouses, that those tactics are no longer effective. And so we're learning as we go as well. And then just to be honest, I think that one of the biggest things about this process is that we figured out that one of the techniques that they are using to actually thwart democracy in Detroit is that Duggan and some of his hired hands, many of those are Black and brown leaders in Detroit, have a hold on the mailing ballots as it relates to some of the senior buildings. So many of your seniors, for small trinkets and tokens and some attention and care, are giving up their democratic rights and their voting power to people that don't share our interests. And so I think as we're able to dismantle and debunk some of that manipulation that's happening at the ground level, I think that too will help us do a better job of being able to deliver at the polls and also at the ballot box.
Yeah, I super appreciate that. I agree with everything that Mama Monica just said. I think one like kind of specific niche lesson that that I think we learned that we're trying to pull some stuff together to share a little bit more broadly is like the nitty gritty of following the money. So I'm going to drop a few things. So one of them is here. I'm just going to drop this link. That right there was one of the things that sparked for us a few things. So we went through Wayne County Clerk, all of the things that are legally required to be reported, and really understanding what's required to be reported and what's not, because they're banking on us not knowing. And so this was one of the things that for us was really helpful. So we pulled up this statement, which was filed on July 18th. And what that did was that told us, okay, there is a committee that is filed in opposition to Proposal P. It has a handful of donors. Its two biggest donors are DTE and Blue Cross Blue Shield. But in the grand scheme of things, they didn't kick in that much money. DTE kicked in $50,000. Blue Cross Blue Shield kicked in $25,000, and they only had $30,000 in expenditures, because we can see their expenditures. And it said, well, hold on, they paid an LLC, they paid 2 political consultants, but that's it. That can't be it, because we are seeing all these billboards and radio ads and all these things all over the place. Well, the committee, what we did was we took a look at this, then we took a look at the billboards, and we noticed that the name of the committee and the name of the billboards were almost identical, but they weren't identical. The PO boxes were different. The committee was called the Committee to Protect Detroit's Future. Well, what was the paying for all the billboards was called Detroiters to Protect Our Future. They were different organizations. Both of them were filed in May, right? So the committee got filed in May. There was a C4 organization called Detroiters to Protect Our Future that was filed in May. They paid for all of the billboards, all of the radio ads, all of the TV ads. We went through and we talked to some of the TV stations and radio stations to try and get how much money was spent. Some of them were able to give us estimates around how much things cost at that time, but not comprehensively. So we said, okay, what they're doing is one, DTE and Blue Cross Blue Shield likely slipped up. This was likely late money that they put in, which it was, because we can see when they donated to cover some expenses for consultants for this committee that had happened. What we don't get to see is how much money they put into Detroiters to Protect Our Future, the dark money operation, because that dark money operation did not say vote no on Prop P. It said Prop P is a problem. That's considered issue education. That is not considered election advocacy. Because it's considered issue education, they do not need to disclose or report their donors. They don't have to do any of that. It's all dark money, which means we don't get to see how it's being spent, where it's coming from, any of that. They're very, very good at setting up these organizations quickly and moving a lot of money. So it, you know, as someone who we do billboards and TV ads and radio ads around elections, we know how much that costs. This had to be over $500,000 at least, at minimum, that was put in the months of June and July around Prop P. Everywhere you went, every radio station, every TV. I mean, you all, for folks who are in the Detroit area, saw all of that. That was at least minimum $500,000 that was put into all of that. We don't know where it came from. We can make some guesses because DTE was the largest contributor to the committee. Blue Cross Blue Shield contributed. We can also imagine who might be some of the moneyed allies of the mayor, who was working really hard to thwart proposal P. So we learned some of these lessons that are really important that we have to like get into the nitty gritty. The other thing within that for me was a really big lesson is we also have to educate journalists. We know like a lot of our media sources, local media, papers, even our mainstream ones like the Free Press and the News and all of that, many of their kind of investigative journalist departments have been completely eroded, right? They don't have some of those resources. And so we were having to do conversations on background with journalists covering this, explaining to them what a C4 was, explaining to them this is the legislation or this is the regulation that guides them. This is why we can't see some of this money. And this is why we can see this other money. Because what was happening up until then, until we could see this in July, and we were able to get some big stories out in the Free Press and the Detroit News and in some other places that were saying who's the money behind the opposition to Prop P. But before that, all that we saw happening from the media was regurgitating the ridiculous numbers that the city had come up with, which was saying this is going to cost all of this money. And so then the narrative in the short term became about the Supreme Court deciding, the governor opposing, and this is going to cost an insane amount of money. This is a wild amount of money. That was the narrative from local media that didn't interrogate any of those things because one, under-resourced, two, like bought hook, line, and sinker some of the lines coming from opposition, especially the official lines coming from the city. And so we weren't able to combat that narrative until very late. And it's rooted in understanding, one, follow the money. Who is the opposition? What do they have to benefit? How can we see what they can contribute? And knowing the regulations around what is transparent to the public and what is not transparent to the public so that we can make inferences, so we can educate our people around this. That's when for us, alarm bells went really, really loud because we're continuing, fights against DTE, who is likely, in my estimation, DTE is the most sophisticated political actor in the state. There are only 6 members of the state legislature that do not receive DTE money. They're an investor-owned utility operating as a public utility, and they depend on their ability to completely dominate state politics to resist change. And so we see some of this playing out, and those are really, really critical lessons that we want to make sure are accessible to more and more organizers.
Just really quickly to build on what Art just said, it's also important too that some of these actors, we know them and we know their receipts in terms of having being the facilitators and straw bosses of this harm. Case in point being Reverend Sheffield. When you look at Reverend Sheffield and the role that he's played in the city, he has been a fence straddler in political arenas and issues from top to bottom, everything from labor issues to the bankruptcy to pensions being stolen. And so we have to also educate our community when we use the facilities of these persons, when we go and participate in a turkey giveaway or a ham giveaway, you lend your credibility to that person. And so we've had to spend some time really educating even community leaders on the fact that when these harms are continuously perpetuated by these particular actors, we must isolate and alienate them out of our community work. And so we've actually had to lift that too, talking about the fact that when you see a Carol Banks, who not only worked for the emergency manager, she's worked for 2 of them. When you see a Carol Banks able to maneuver throughout multiple situations of corruption among leaders that she's worked for, then you have to question that. When you look at the fact that Judge Rhodes, who facilitated the bankruptcy, was over the bankruptcy for the city of Detroit, that then turned around and went to work for Jones Day and actually carving up and restructuring the utilities in Puerto Rico, and then came back to facilitate the oversight of emergency management over Detroit's school system, then this is not us sort of playing in sandboxes. This is real stuff that's happening where people are using our communities like a chessboard to manipulate assets and power. And so the reason I just wanted to lift that, because I have to name these people, because what happens is Duggan and these actors out of the Mackinac think tank have been very shrewd in making sure that they can put Black and brown faces in positions of power and leadership so that there's this perpetuation. It's not us and it's not racist. It's just you not making good political decisions in who you're electing. No, when you look at the record of Gary Brown and Santel Jenkins, they didn't get paid as they did the dirty deed. They got paid with positions and contracts after they did the dirty deed. So that we have to follow the money, not only when they're in office, we've got to follow the money trail once they leave office, because now many of them are getting paid with those contracts after they leave the position of power.
These are all such important lessons. I'm so happy that we were able to have this conversation with all of you. I think we're going to wrap it up. This was such an insightful conversation. I want to emphasize that any, information that you guys shared in the chat and resources, we are going to compile and send it out to participants. This video will be available on our YouTube channel. If you have additional resources that you'd like to share with us for the participants, please email them to us. If there's no more last words, John, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, something I did just want to mention real quickly. A lot of the work for the Detroiters Bill of Rights, and it's a shame that she couldn't be on today, but Councilmember Raquel Castaneda-Lopez did so much. And as we talk about the connection between what bad actors might be doing in the city and why they're doing it, when we talk about organizations and individuals that use their microphone, right, to prop up the current system and hierarchy, I think we also have to point out what positive leadership can look like. And when there are questions around what it can mean to model yourself after somebody in our community who is invested, who shows up when they say they're going to show up, who does what they say they're going to do. Individuals like Councilmember Castaneda-Lopez is a great example of that, right? And I think that you see that in the history of her work in the community and how we're modeling ourselves and growing. So just wanted to uplift everything that she did, and especially because she couldn't be on here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And she is a social work alum, right? And I think all of you are models to us, as well as she, of what we should look like as leaders, or if we ever hold office, and how we should really be advocating for people. So I want to thank you all so much for joining. This was an excellent conversation. And Fatima, I don't know if you can switch us to the last slide really quick, just so we can talk about our next. So we do have all of these discussions are available on our website, which you see at the top. We do have an upcoming virtual discussion on November 11th, 12 p.m. The rise of anti-Asian American sentiment and community resiliency. We'll share the RSVP in the chat. Thank you again so much, everyone. This is fantastic. And thank you for all the work you do.
Thanks
Have a
to
good
all
one,
our
everyone.
panelists. Thanks for joining us today.